Picture a shield wall somewhere in northern England more than 1,000 years ago. The enemy line is closing in, and off to one side stand a handful of fighters who look nothing like the rest of the army. No mail, no helmets, some of them stripped down to bare skin in the cold. Their jaws are clenched, spit is running down their chins, and their eyes have gone somewhere far away. History books call these men berserkers, the legendary rage fighters of the Viking world, warriors who supposedly felt no pain, feared nothing, and lost themselves completely in battle. For generations, the accepted explanation was a mushroom, the famous red-capped toadstool everyone recognizes from fairy tales. That was the story taught for 200 years straight. Then scientists actually got their hands on the bones. Ancient DNA testing and modern drug analysis moved in, and almost the entire textbook version collapsed. The plant wasn't the one everyone assumed. The identity of these men wasn't what everyone assumed either. And strangest of all, they never really vanished from history. Their descendants are walking around Norway right now, completely unaware of it. To understand how wrong the old story was, you first need to understand where it came from. Everything we know about berserkers traces back to Old Norse sagas, written down in Iceland and Norway between roughly the 1100s and 1300s, though the stories themselves were passed down by word of mouth for centuries before anyone put pen to parchment. What's striking is how much these separate texts, written by different authors decades or even centuries apart, agree with each other on the details. Take the Ynglinga saga, put together by the Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson in the early 1200s. It talks about fighters who charged into combat with no armor at all, who had the strength of bears or wild oxen, who dropped enemies with a single strike, and who supposedly couldn't be hurt by blade or flame. Egil's saga, one of the richest sources we have, describes a character's grandfather as someone who transformed into a berserker after dark, becoming so dangerous that even his own family kept their distance. Then there's the Haraldskvedi, a praise poem from the 800s written for King Harald Fairhair, which lists berserkers among his personal fighting force and describes them chewing on the edges of their shields and screaming like wild animals before the fighting started. Even the name has sparked centuries of debate among scholars. In Old Norse, berserker is a combination of two words. The second part, serker, clearly means shirt or tunic. The first part, bear, is where the argument lives. It could mean bear, which would make these bear shirt warriors dressed in animal pelts, or it could mean bear, meaning they fought without any shirt whatsoever. Both readings show up in the sagas. Some berserkers are described wrapped in animal skins, others are described fighting half-naked in freezing weather. Whatever the precise translation, one thing is clear. This wasn't just a nickname for any tough soldier. It described a distinct, recognized role that everyone across the Norse world understood. Their standing in Viking society was oddly split. On one side, they were prized. Kings kept them as personal bodyguards and used them as shock troops to break enemy lines during major campaigns. The Haraldskvedi places them right inside the king's inner circle. Egil's saga describes rulers all over Scandinavia competing to recruit them. But on the other side, people were terrified of them. The same sagas that praised their usefulness in war also describe them as unstable and dangerous to have as neighbors, prone to attacking people during fits of fury. And more than once, ordinary farmers band together in these stories to kill a berserker once he'd become more trouble than he was worth. The timeline and geography of the phenomenon are also fairly well pinned down. Berserkers show up most heavily in records from roughly the 700s through the 1000s, concentrated in Norway and Sweden, with battlefield mentions stretching across the whole reach of Viking expansion, from raids in the British Isles to campaigns in France to trade routes running deep into what's now Russia. Once Scandinavia converted to Christianity in the 1000s and 1100s, the berserker essentially disappears from written records. Icelandic law codes from that era specifically ban the practice of going berserk. Whatever system had been producing these fighters got shut down within a couple of generations, and the berserker shifted from a real, active role into pure legend. That's really the mystery that sat unsolved for close to 1,000 years. The saga accounts are too consistent with each other and too specific in their physical details to be nothing more than poetic exaggeration. The trembling, the frothing at the mouth, the seeming immunity to injury, followed by total collapse and days of exhaustion afterward. Those aren't the kind of details a poet invents for drama. They read like an actual medical description of something happening to real bodies. Something was chemically altering these men before combat, on command, and then wearing off afterward. The question that stuck around for centuries was simple. What was it? The theory that eventually took over the history books came from a surprisingly unlikely place. Back in 1784, a Swedish clergyman and amateur naturalist named Samuel Ödman wrote a short paper arguing that the berserker rage came from eating fly agaric, the classic red and white spotted mushroom found across forests throughout the northern hemisphere. Ödman wasn't a chemist or a doctor. He never tried the mushroom himself, never studied a Viking-era skeleton, and never tested a single archaeological sample. What he had was a comparison built entirely on reading. His argument had two parts. First, a geographic one. He pointed out that Siberian peoples, shamans among groups like the Koryak, Chukchi, and Sami, were documented eating fly agaric for trance rituals and visions. He reasoned that since trade and migration connected Siberia to Scandinavia, the mushroom's reputation could plausibly have spread west into the Norse world too. Second, a loosely scientific comparison. Udman had read descriptions of Siberian mushroom use mentioning altered perception, dulled pain, and agitation, and he thought these lined up well enough with the saga descriptions of berserkers to publish his theory. It was a clean, memorable idea. It explained the rage, the foaming mouth, the seeming immunity to wounds, and it tied Vikings into a broader picture of shamanic cultures across Eurasia, which fit nicely with the comparative mythology scholars were fascinated by at the time. A dramatic red mushroom, a secret warrior cult, a transformation into violence. It made for a great story, and great stories stick. For 2 centuries, this idea just kept getting repeated, showing up in encyclopedias, school textbooks, documentaries, and eventually video games and fantasy novels. Nearly every popular image of a mushroom-chewing Viking berserker traces directly back to one 18th century Swedish clergyman who never once verified his own idea. The theory survived mostly because nothing better came along to challenge it. Through the 1800s and most of the 1900s, there simply wasn't the scientific technology to test pharmacological claims about people who'd been dead for 1,000 years. No one could analyze chemical residue on old pottery. No one could run toxicology on ancient bones. No one could reliably identify tiny plant fragments buried in old graves. Researchers had only the sagas and a handful of grave goods to work with, and they made reasonable guesses given what they had. But in the absence of hard evidence, a guess from 1784 simply held its ground by getting there first. Repeated often enough, across enough textbooks, it started to look like established fact rather than a hunch. By the late 1900s, it was almost impossible to find a popular book about Vikings that didn't mention fly agaric as the secret behind berserker rage. The trouble is that virtually the whole theory had been built before anyone could actually test the chemistry involved, and once real toxicology got applied to it, the classic version didn't hold up. Starting in the late 1900s and picking up speed through the early 2000s, researchers began asking the one question Udman had skipped entirely. What does fly agaric actually do to a human body? The answer, once doctors compiled 2 centuries' worth of clinical poisoning cases, didn't match the sagas at all. The active chemicals in fly agaric are muscimol and ibotenic acid, both of which act on the central nervous system. And their documented effects are drowsiness, nausea, vomiting, heavy sweating, loss of muscle coordination, confusion, slurred speech, and at higher doses, simply passing out. It's a sedative, not a stimulant. Somebody who'd eaten enough fly agaric to feel its effects would be far more likely to throw up and fall asleep than to sprint screaming into a wall of enemy shields. Even the Siberian comparison that had propped up the theory for 200 years fell apart under closer study. When researchers actually looked at how Siberian cultures used the mushroom, they found a tradition built around stillness, quiet visionary trances, often lying down inside a tent while others watched over them for hours, used for interpreting dreams and communicating with spirits. There was no tradition anywhere of using it before combat. The whole cultural use of the mushroom was essentially the opposite of what the berserker theory needed it to be. So the mismatch became undeniable. The sagas describe men whose physical strength and pain tolerance actually increased, who kept fighting effectively through wounds that would down an ordinary soldier, who stayed coordinated throughout the fight, and who only collapsed once it was over. Fly agaric produces basically the reverse of that. By the early 2010s, researchers had shifted their attention to a different plant entirely. Hyoscyamus niger, commonly known as black henbane. It grows wild all over northern Europe, including Scandinavia, and Norse-era healers would have known it well. Its active compounds, hyoscyamin and scopolamine, belong to a chemical family called tropane alkaloids, the same family found in belladonna and datura, and their effects on the body are almost the exact opposite of what fly agaric produces. Documented cases of henbane poisoning line up with the saga descriptions astonishingly well. Rather than sedation, henbane causes intense agitation. It triggers vivid hallucinations, often violent or paranoid ones. It's known for producing a strong dissociation from pain, one of the most consistently reported effects in poisoning cases. It causes a racing heartbeat and flushed, hot skin. Crucially, it also causes excessive drooling and frothing at the mouth because it interferes with the body's normal swallowing reflex, matching the exact detail that shows up again and again in saga descriptions of berserkers losing themselves before battle. And in the aftermath, henbane produces exactly the kind of severe multi-day exhaustion described in Eagle's saga and elsewhere. This wasn't a loose resemblance, it matched point for point. Where fly agaric caused sleepiness, Henbane caused frenzy. Where fly agaric had zero history of combat use anywhere on Earth, Henbane produced precisely the symptom list that Norse warriors had been described exhibiting for 1,000 years. That raised an obvious next question. Was there any physical proof the Vikings had actually used it? The proof came out of the ground in Denmark. In 1977, archaeologists digging at Firkat, a circular fortress built during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth in the late 900s, opened a burial that stood out from everything around it. It belonged to a woman buried around 980 AD, and her grave goods marked her as someone of real importance. She'd been laid in a wagon body, a burial style reserved for high-status individuals. She wore silver toe rings, unheard of anywhere else in the Norse archaeological record. Buried alongside her were a bronze bowl imported from Central Asia, a metal staff of the kind linked in Norse poetry to ritual practitioners, and a small leather pouch that initially puzzled the excavation team. Inside that pouch were several hundred seeds. When specialists identified them, the seeds turned out to be black henbane. This discovery confirmed something the sagas had only hinted at. Henbane was being deliberately gathered, stored, and buried alongside a woman whose other possessions marked her as some kind of ritual specialist. Most researchers now identify the Firkat woman as a völva, a type of Norse seeress described in Eddic poetry as someone who traveled between settlements performing ceremonies, reading visions, and dispensing substances that altered people's states of mind. And Firkat wasn't an isolated case. Henbane seeds have since turned up in other Viking-era sites, tied to warrior burials and ritual deposits across Scandinavia, always in ceremonial rather than everyday domestic contexts. This wasn't some ordinary kitchen herb. It was a tightly controlled substance, handled by trained specialists for specific purposes. Once researchers laid the documented symptoms of henbane poisoning side by side with the saga descriptions, the match held up across every category. The trembling described before comet lines up with the early agitation phase of tropane alkaloid poisoning. The frothing at the mouth matches the drooling caused by scopolamine's effect on the swallow reflex. The apparent immunity to wounds fits with the powerful pain-blocking effect the drug produces at higher doses. And the multi-day collapse afterward matches the well-documented recovery period from tropane poisoning almost exactly. Egel's saga even describes a berserker named Ljot, who howled and bit at his shield before a fight, then was left unable to function for days. A profile that reads like a textbook henbane recovery. The ritual setting implied by the Firkat find also makes far more sense than the mushroom theory ever did. In the sagas, a berserker isn't simply a guy who munches something before heading into a fight on his own. He's part of an organized group drawn from particular families, attached to particular kings, deployed in particular ways, and put through initiation rites the texts only vaguely describe. A dangerous plant administered by trained specialists fits that picture perfectly. A man foraging his own mushroom breakfast does not. In other words, this wasn't a personal habit. It was a managed institutional process. Someone grew the plant, controlled the dose, oversaw the recovery, and the fighter who emerged from that process wasn't acting alone. He was the product of a system that had trained a specialist, run a ritual, and manufactured, on demand, a man capable of things ordinary soldiers couldn't do. So the drug mystery had an answer. But the identity of the men themselves was still an open question. For most of modern history, popular and even academic writing treated berserkers as a group set apart from everyday Norse society. A recurring idea throughout the 1800s and early 1900s was that they represented a separate bloodline entirely, maybe descendants of some older Northern European population, maybe outsiders brought in through Viking trade networks, but in any case, biologically distinct from the ordinary farmers and fishermen who made up most of Scandinavia. In this view, the berserker wasn't just culturally different, he was supposedly a different kind of person altogether, genetically speaking. Just like Odman's mushroom theory, this idea was built without the evidence needed to actually test it. And just like the mushroom theory, it didn't survive once real evidence showed up. Ancient DNA research on Viking-era skeletons accelerated massively through the 2010s, powered by the same sequencing technology that had already reshaped our understanding of prehistoric populations elsewhere in the world. That work reached a major milestone in 2020 when an international team based at the University of Copenhagen sequenced the genomes of more than 400 individuals from Viking-era burial sites spread across Scandinavia and the wider Viking world, from Norway and Sweden to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and the river systems of modern Russia and Ukraine. The results overturned several long-held assumptions about who the Vikings actually were. Far from being one uniform Scandinavian population, the genetic data showed steady movement of people into Scandinavia from southern Europe, the British Isles, and Central Asia throughout the Viking period, creating a genuinely mixed society where people of very different ancestral backgrounds lived, fought, and were buried side by side. Within that larger data set, researchers were finally able to look closely at high-status warrior burials, including several identified through grave goods and skeletal evidence as likely berserkers or members of similar elite fighting groups. And these remains showed nothing unusual. They weren't genetic outliers. They didn't cluster separately from anyone else. They carried no sign of descent from some hidden, separate population. Genetically, they sat right in the middle of the normal range for Viking-era Norway and Sweden, indistinguishable from the farmers and craftsmen buried in the graves around them. The implication is direct. The Berserker wasn't a genetic outsider. He wasn't imported from somewhere else, and he wasn't the last of some vanished tribe. He was simply a local man, pulled from the exact same population that worked the coastline and farmed the valleys. What separated him from his neighbors wasn't his ancestry. It was the institution that had claimed him. The capacity to go berserk wasn't written into his blood. It came from the system that selected him, trained him, dosed him with Henbane, and sent him out to fight. This finding flips the whole question on its head. The interesting part of the Berserker story was never really about where these men came from. It's about what was done to them. The transformation described in the Sagas, the shaking, the froth, the pain immunity, the days-long collapse afterward, wasn't some inherited family trait. It was the output of a chemical and ceremonial process that turned ordinary Norwegian farmers into a specific kind of weapon. In this light, the Berserker wasn't some kind of monster or mythical figure. He was a product, manufactured by specialists like the Hyoscyamus, who grew the plant, prepared the dose, and administered it to men whose families had worked the same land for generations. When that institution ended, the manufacturing stopped. But the men themselves and their DNA didn't go anywhere. They went home. And this is where DNA gives us the real answer, though it needs to be stated carefully. Large-scale genetic studies of present-day Scandinavians, drawing on tens of thousands of genome samples from Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic biobanks, have established a clear direct genetic thread connecting Viking-era populations to modern Scandinavians. In most cases, the genetic distance between a 10th century Norwegian warrior and a Norwegian farmer alive today is barely measurable. The same Y chromosome lineages found in Viking-era warrior graves, including graves interpreted as belonging to berserker fighters, turn up at high frequency among Norwegian men today. Specific ancient lineages have even been traced forward to living people from the same regions where the original burials were dug up. In genetic terms, the berserkers never disappeared when Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the thousands. What disappeared was the institution that produced them. The ritual specialists who handled the Henbane vanished. The chemical and ceremonial pipeline that turned ordinary men into that battlefield state was dismantled within a few generations of conversion, and Icelandic law explicitly banned the practice of going berserk from that point forward. But the men who'd carried out that role didn't vanish along with the practice. They'd already had children, both before the tradition ended and throughout the centuries it operated. Those children had children of their own, and that chain has continued unbroken for 1,000 years since the last recorded berserker set down his weapon. That's a sharp contrast with how popular culture treats the berserker. In documentaries, movies, and fantasy fiction, he's usually portrayed as an extinct archetype, a mythical figure that vanished along with the Viking Age itself, treated the same way people talk about a lost civilization whose disappearance is the whole point of the story. But the genetics tell a completely different story. Nothing actually disappeared in the way people assume. What ended was a practice, not a bloodline. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't mean. Finding berserker ancestry alive in modern Norway isn't a claim that today's Norwegians carry some hereditary spark of rage, or that descendants of berserkers are biologically different from anyone around them in any way. Going berserk was a cultural and pharmacological event. It needed the plant, the trained specialist, the ceremony, and the social structure that tied all three together. None of that gets passed down through DNA. What DNA records is ancestry, meaning who was related to whom, not what job someone once had. A berserker bloodline isn't some special or sinister lineage, it's just an ordinary Norwegian one. What the genetic evidence really shows is that the berserker, as a type of person, was never actually separate from the wider Norwegian population to begin with. He came out of it, was reshaped by a system for a while, and then folded right back into it once that system was shut down. The men who survived their time in that role, who lived past the usual lifespan for that kind of dangerous work, settled back into ordinary villages and farmed the same valleys as everyone else. They married, had families, and their genetic lines flowed straight back into the wider population they'd originally been pulled from. The men buried at Fyrkat and other similar sites where Henbane and warrior remains have turned up together are in a very literal genetic sense the direct ancestors of people living in Norway today. There's no separate, hidden bloodline running quietly alongside everyone else. There's only the general population itself, which simply absorbed them back in. The DNA has confirmed what basic demographics always suggested. The berserkers didn't go anywhere. They just stopped being berserkers, went home, and their descendants are still farming the same land today, looking exactly like everyone else around them. So the legendary image, the foaming, screaming, armorless warrior charging the front line of a Viking shield wall, turns out to be only half true. The mushroom explanation, repeated confidently for 200 years on the strength of one 18th century guess, was simply wrong. The real drug was Henbane, cultivated and stored and dosed out by trained ritual specialists like the woman buried at Firkat with hundreds of seeds sealed inside a leather pouch. And the Berserkers themselves were never a separate race, a foreign warrior caste, or a lost tribe. They were ordinary Norwegian men, shaped for a time by an institution that no longer exists, and their descendants are still living in the very same valleys their ancestors once fought and raided from. The real twist in the Berserker story was never the drug. It's the disappearance that everyone assumed happened, but that the evidence now shows never actually did. The system that created them is gone. The men and their descendants are not.